We are doing Unit 6, Lesson 4 on group behavior today. And our key terms are adaptation, fitness, and altruistic behavior. So remember, there's a link below my video where you guys can click on it and get the notes for this lesson. So just make sure you do that so you can kind of follow along and take notes as we go. We're starting off here talking a bit about Charles Darwin. Remember him? Remember this guy, right? He published on the origin of species and was kind of the first to come to the table with his theory of natural selection by evolution. He saw that characteristics, traits could be passed down from one generation to the next. He didn't know anything about DNA. He didn't know anything about genes because they didn't know that stuff back then. So he didn't really understand how it got passed down. He just knew that those traits were inherited. Remember that this deals with what we call adaptations. Adaptations are traits that are heritable, so they have to be some that are passed down from generation to generation that help to improve the survivability of that particular organism. So they improve the fitness, right? And remember that fitness doesn't necessarily mean that you're super strong and physically fit. It just means that you have a better likelihood of survival. So sometimes that certainly could mean speed, agility, strength, that kind of stuff, but it could also mean camouflage or a better strategy for hiding from predators, or maybe a better way to find warmth in colder winter months, like migratory patterns and stuff like that. So those are all still considered adaptations. So because these organisms possess those adaptations, those inheritable traits, they increase their likelihood of surviving and reproducing. You need to both survive and have babies to pass your traits on to the next generation. And again, Darwin didn't know that meant you had to pass your genes on, but we know that today. We know that that's a way in which we can pass on those traits is through our genomes. So what we're looking at today isn't just individual survivability, but traits that a group possesses and how that those group traits affect the survival of the species. So just move on to the next page. So we talk about some group behaviors because not all behaviors that organisms have are behaviors that benefit just themselves. There are also behaviors that can benefit the group at large. For example, they talk about prey animals that are herding. So different animals that are prey tend to forage for food in herds. They tend to stick together in herds because you've probably heard the phrase that there's, survival in numbers, right? So these organisms, these animals tend to survive better in large groups than they would individually. You can have some that look out for others, and send the alarm out when there's a predator nearby. They have a better likelihood of locating food sources and stuff like that. Um, you know, Young, which tend to be more likely to be, I guess, a bit more vulnerable to predators and climate and stuff like that, are better taken care of in groups and things like that. So there's many different reasons why a group is beneficial, being in a group. It doesn't necessarily benefit the individual, however, right? I mean, if you're an individual and you're strong and you can get, you can fend for yourself and you can get your own food, sharing might not be something you feel like is the most beneficial to you as an individual, but it helps the group at large. And if you want a species to survive, helping the group at large is kind of an important thing. Another example is fish schooling. When fish move together in schools, they tend to be more difficult to catch. They are going to kind of dazzle their predator, right, with their movement. And so the predator has a harder time catching an individual fish when it's part of a school than it does when it's all by itself. So again, that makes them more likely to survive. And again, hunting in groups, as we mentioned, or foraging in group is well, hunting specifically with predators, they tend to be able to take down larger prey and get a larger supply of food than they would be able to do individually. So those are types of group behaviors and how they benefit the group, really. But as I said before, behavior that benefits the group with that maybe makes it less beneficial for the individual is called altruism. And when we see what altruism is, so the definition here is behavior exhibited by individuals within a group that potentially reduces the fitness of that individual, but enhances the fitness of other members of the group. So, at the expense of the individual's survival, it might enhance the ability of some other individual in the group or the group at large to have a better shot of survival. And this is something that's been kind of a debated point when you're looking at the study of evolution by natural selection, because it seems to be counterintuitive. If survival of the fittest means that there's competition within a species, right, to be able to survive, and only those within that same species that possess the traits that enable their survival will go on to pass those traits on to the next generation, then what is in it for the individual to actually, help support somebody else within the population? Why would an individual give up their opportunity of survival for the opportunity of somebody else within their population? So that's kind of what the rest of this lesson is talking about. First, they give a few different examples. For example, groups of monkeys. Certain monkeys are going to call out and warn other monkeys that there's a predator nearby. And by calling out, you're drawing attention to yourself, or that monkey's drawing attention to itself, and it potentially is increasing its likelihood of being targeted by that predator at the expense of helping out the rest of the monkeys that are part of that group, right? Trying to get that group to flee. Bats sharing food. It mentions that vampire bats need to eat daily to survive. When they return to their cave bats, um, that were successful in getting food will sometimes regurgitate the food to share it with others who are not successful. So they're helping survivability of the whole group of bats by regurgitating part of their meal to feed those bats that couldn't eat. Birds protecting other nests other than their own. So in this case, we're talking about birds that help defend other birds' territory from, say, a fox or something like that, even if it's not their nest, it's not even their species. So there's a lot of talk about why would this ever be something that would, how would we explain this essentially using Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection? Like I said, it seems to kind of go against it because it's not really survival of the fittest at that point, right? Because some of these organisms, the bat that didn't get the food, isn't the fittest. And yet the group is trying to get that individual to survive. So it goes on to explain that it is believed that altruistic behavior really is only something that happens when the favors is returned. So you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, right? So because one organism helps out another, the expectation is that they do that for the return of that favor in the future. So in a sense, it actually is helping them out because they realize that they will also benefit from that relationship. Um, the other thing here, let me just kind of get to that part in the lesson. It talks about is something called a kin selection. And kin selection is a type of altruistic adaptive behavior where individual animals choose to protect their closest relatives. So obviously their children, but also, sisters, brothers, anything within their clan, and that kind of stuff, cousins, anything like that. And again, they may even put their own like lives at risk to protect others that are related to them. And so again, you might wonder, how does this ever get supported by natural selection, by evolution by means of natural selection? It kind of seems to go against it as well. But interestingly, they talk about how, if you think about it, your kin carries some of your own DNA. So by ensuring the survivability of your kin, you are actually increasing the likelihood that your DNA will be passed on to future generations. So while individually, selfishly, there isn't anything in it for that individual, there is something in it for the gene line of that individual. It's a way to ensure that that gene line does not die off with the individual. You're increasing the likelihood of those genes getting passed on to the next generation. So basically, let's see. Again, okay, they talk a little bit more about other things as well, how, being in groups, helping to make sure that the group stays strong as a whole, helps to increase the likelihood of survival of the individual within that group because the group, again, is, there's some sort of um, kind of a better capacity to survive when you're working in a group. So altruistic behavior in nature isn't necessarily truly altruistic. It is still has kind of a selfish means to it as well, right? It still benefits that individual, whether it benefits them personally or it benefits the ability for them to pass on their genes to the next generation. But that is how it can still happen in nature, even though you might think it's counterintuitive to evolution by means of natural selection. So that is pretty much it for this lesson, ladies and gentlemen. If you've got questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in our next one.